Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. I often get accused of being a shill for grinding gear games. This isn't true, and hopefully this video will put those arguments to bed. There is a design flaw in Path of Exile 2 that is causing a lot of problems, especially in the softcore trade league environment at the moment, but I do think that these will flow on to all the other game modes until they're addressed. I'm pointing this out despite being very positive about the game in general, because I think this is the sort of thing that is going to get worse as the game ages, unless it's addressed very promptly. And that's because grinding gear games are working on a whole bunch of new classes at the moment, a whole bunch of new Ascendancies, but those of them that suffer from this flaw are going to end up basically being unplayable. They'll be disappointing if you do level them through the campaign and get them into endgame, but you won't know that until you're solidly at endgame and you're trying to farm with them. What we're looking at here is build diversity as measured by the top 1,000 characters by XP. It's worth noting that in softcore trade, you can get pretty high up on this just by virtue of having gear that's so strong that you don't really ever die. And so wealthier players tend to be disproportionately represented on this. It's also worth saying that there is a lot more build diversity actually in hardcore at the moment, a point we'll return to in a second. Hardcore, despite the fact that it puts more requirements on your character, that actually is not seeing this consolidation on 4 different Ascendancies. What is it that the Stormweaver, the Deadeye, the Invoker, and the Infernalist have in common? And it's not something that the other Ascendancies don't have at all. It's just that people are generally consolidating on those 4. If those Ascendancies were nerfed into oblivion, then you would probably see the Chronomancer and the Blood Mage take their place, and potentially the Witch Hunter and the Gemling Legionnaire as well. What we're seeing here is the indirect effects of Magic Find, which is something that will seem absolutely absurd at first, but I promise there's madness to my method in claiming that. Certain Ascendancies don't require as much investment in defense as others, and they don't require as much investment in terms of just general levels of affixes on gear into other offensive stats. So I want you to consider here 2 particular builds that people could be playing. Be playing a physical damage Titan build that donks people on the head with a big mace, or you could be playing a Chronomancer. We'll use the off-meta version, but you're a Chronomancer Archmage build that is casting lightning spells such as Spark and is empowering them through the use of Archmage. So what are the mandatory prefixes if you're playing the Archmage? Well, mana. Mana is essential because the numbers are really high on it and it's a big source of your damage. So you're going to feel that that is absolutely mandatory. Life would be really nice to have on your Chronomancer, but it's not essential. It's really good though. If you can get it, you definitely want it. And then there's nothing else that's really essential. There's a bunch of things that are like a little bit okay, like evasion rating, and the plus percentage increase to lightning damage. This is a good stat, but you don't get enough of it. So that means that it's not really pulling you into picking it. It's just something that you'd take as a bonus on gear. What this means is that the opportunity cost for investing in item rarity on your Chronomancer / Stormweaver is actually pretty low. And so you can look for a ring that's got the Dragon's prefix on it. Or if you can't afford the Dragon's prefix, you can go for Hoarders or Pirates and then work your way up until you can afford the much better versions of the items that have Dragon's prefix on them. Let's look quickly instead though at that same prefix pressure for a Titan. Here, you definitely need life. Life is not negotiable. Here, you absolutely are going to need life and a high tier of it because you're up close and personal, therefore you're taking a bunch of hits. You're going to need physical damage to attacks because this is a fair bit of damage. This is a fair bit of your character's overall damage power budget in a way that this mod for the Archmage was not. And then you're probably going to need accuracy because the numbers on the accuracy rolls are really big. So that's 3 prefixes that feel mandatory, and even though there's things that might feel nice, like evasion rating or even mana, like you've got to get mana somewhere, although you do get some of it through your character's just general progression, there's a few things that could be nice here, but ultimately you feel like your prefixes for your best in slot ring are already kind of locked in, and therefore increased item rarity, it's going to be a much bigger cost in order to fit this in. Now, if we have a look at the suffixes, the same story applies just with different numbers. The Titan is going to need to cap all 4 resistances. And what that means is that it's probably going to need to dedicate 2 of the suffixes on the item to being resistances. Well, that doesn't leave that much left, especially because these life regen per second mods, these are somewhat important on a character that's going to be up close and personal. Maybe not absolutely mandatory, but they're going to feel important. Likewise, leech X% physical attack damage as life is going to feel really important as well. What this means is that the Titan doesn't have that many choices here. Whereas for your Stormweaver / Chronomancer, yes, you want cast speed. After you've got cast speed, you want to get 1 resistance, but you don't really need to have 2, and therefore it's a little bit lower opportunity cost again in order to spec into increased item rarity. And that fundamentally is the problem. There are ascendancies where speccing into increased item rarity on gear comes at a relatively low cost when it comes to your character's overall power budget. The Stormweaver is the most obvious example of this, but it's also true of the Infernalist to a very large extent, also the Chronomancer and the Blood Mage, but these are just on the same base classes and worse than those Ascendancies, so people aren't that interested in playing them. And to a lesser extent, it's also true for those Ascendancies that don't go into close combat quite as much. I want to contrast all of this to the way that it looks in Hardcore instead. Now in Hardcore, I haven't prepared the graph, but it's a lot more even than what we see here. There's no individual Ascendancy that's taking up 45% of the ladder, and there's also no subset of 4 of them that are collectively 80% of the ladder, or more than 80%, more like 85%. The difference there is that in Hardcore, you can't invest in the same way into increased item rarity on gear, or at least not with the currently existing gear in that league. There's simply not gear of sufficient quality to be able to condense down item stats that are important to your character on a small number of items, and then go all out on Magic Find on the other stat slots. So, what we're looking at here is a situation where Magic Find is acting like a boot stomping down on build diversity. This, I think, is a real design problem. One of the good things about a game coming out in early access is that design flaws like this can be found and they can be expunged from the game. Until grinding your games fix up the issues that Magic Find causes, and by fix up, this doesn't mean tweaking the numbers on Magic Find a bit, this means getting the stat completely out of the game. Until that point, there's not really much point in them investing in designing a new class, because when that new class comes out, everyone that's optimization focused, and face it, everyone that gets into the ladder is optimization focused, every single one of those players is going to ignore that new class, unless it's one that you can then build Magic Find into realistically. If you can build Magic Find into it realistically, then it'll end up being a new Stormweaver. If you can't, then if the character class is strong, it'll end up being one of the new Gemling Legionnaires, and if it's weak, it will end up being the next Acolyte of Chayula. Now, I know there'll be people out there that are watching this video and thinking, I'm not one of the top 1,000 players by XP, I'm not ever going to be one of the top 1,000 players by XP, I don't get to play that much. Does it matter to me whether or not there's build diversity at the top end like that? As long as there's build diversity lower down, that should be fine. I think the problem we're going to see here, though, is that a lot of the people who are at the top of the ladder, these people tend to be more likely to be movers and shakers, build guide popularizers, and the like. And so what you'll see, if this situation continues, you'll see a situation where if someone goes and has a look at the top 30 streams that are happening on Twitch, they might find that 24 of them are playing Stormweavers, 3 are playing Deadeyes, and 2 are playing Invokers. In this case, the things that they're going to be exposed to information about will be the top Ascendancies. Additionally, there's going to be a lot more demand from build guide creators for ones that are of the better Ascendancies, and as a result, people who are making build guides, people who are capable of making build guides, they will heavily bias towards making build guides for those particular Ascendancies. So, what it would mean is that if we do see a situation where this situation gets worse, you'll find that it's harder and harder to find information on a build guide for a basic Warbringer character, because none of the people who are movers and shakers will be playing that Ascendancy. And as a result, if you do decide that you're set on playing the Warbringer, you don't care about the power level of the Ascendancy, you just like the class power fantasy, then you'll find that you've got less access to advice, and there's also less gear in circulation. Additionally, anything that makes the rich richer within Path of Exile games, because of the amount of trading that takes place in this game, that ends up having ripples throughout the entire Trade League economy for every player. And while these are sometimes positive, sometimes negative, it generally tends to be that the more that wealth concentrates in the hands of a few players at the top, the more that people get locked out of the Trade League economy down the bottom. That's all I got on this. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, and remember that you will get more Vaal Orbs, and for that matter, more of the uncommon and rare currency orbs in general, if you have a whole bunch of increased item rarity at the moment, because in Path of Exile 2, increased item rarity is responsible for helping upgrade currency items from Exalted Orbs to Divine Orbs, or from Transmutation Orbs to Exalted Orbs. It doesn't happen every time, but it happens a lot more when you've got rarity on your character.